Are there any questions and comments that are on your mind? Yes.
I have one that's about, it's actually about the refuge to the Buddha.
Yes.
And it's a story and a question. As I think I may have told you before, I have a friend who is been a Zen Buddhist practitioner for quite some time, and she has learned that she has a rare form of cancer which nothing can be done for her. So she has probably a very limited time to live, and she doesn't want to leave this earth or her pets or her friends and family. And she told me that she doesn't find any refuge in the Buddha. The Buddha doesn't mean anything to her. Or God or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And she felt confused about what's next and frightened.
Mm-hmm.
So I did talk to her for some time, and I told her some things that I thought would be helpful to her, and I would just like to get your take on it too, because I'm going to be seeing her again. So I think we talk about I take refuge in the Buddha, and I think when I first started in Buddhism, I thought, what the heck is that, The Buddha doesn't... Anyway, I'd like to hear your comments.
Well, there's a lot there to what you said, and I find it especially interesting that your friend has studied and practiced Zen, but coming to this stage of her life, she doesn't have what she really needs to meet this stage in her life. So, what taking refuge in the Buddha means, what it means to me, is taking refuge not in the Buddha as a person who somehow exists in some way and is somehow going to help us and meet our needs. That's a kind of idea that's really very Western and very Christian. It's a European idea. And I've never encountered anything to suggest that this was the sense in which the refuges were originally developed and have mostly been used, although I have to qualify that because there are some forms of Buddhism that have developed which are very much like Christianity. There are forms of Buddhism called Pure Land that the idea is that there is a Buddha in the Pure Land of a Buddha who, if they appeal to, even by repeating the name of the Buddha, of the particular Buddha, that through that Buddha's power, a person will be reborn in a pure land at the time of their death. And they're in that pure land. They'll have the direct teachings of that Buddha to bring them to enlightenment. So I mention this just that there are many forms of Buddhism, some of which are very much like the Western Christian ideas that is one of the ways that the refuge can be interpreted. But the way I've always understood it, and I think that the way it's meant to be interpreted, is that when we go for refuge to the Buddha, we're taking refuge in the fact of the Buddha and our knowledge of the fact that the Buddha was a human being like we are, and the Buddha attained his own awakening and liberation through his own efforts, and not as a gift of some supernatural being or supernatural force, or on the basis of some grace bestowed by some other power. And when we go for refuge to some other being, like to a god or a deity, or like the other power of Buddha in a pure land, to me this is quite different than what we really mean by going for refuge to the Buddha, because what we're doing is we're saying, the Buddha, I am a human being like the Buddha was. And therefore, the enlightenment of the Buddha is a possibility for me as well. It's available to me. I too can achieve that same awakening through my own efforts, and not in dependence of something outside of myself. And I was taught to understand that the reason that we repeat these refuges 3 times is that first we're taking refuge in the Buddha of the past, in just the way that I spoke of. But the second time we're taking refuge in the Buddha of the future, who is us, that someday we too will be a Buddha. And that in fact that Buddha nature that will be manifest at the time of our awakening already exists in us. And so that the second time that we take refuge in the Buddha, we're taking refuge in our own future Buddhahood as an established fact. That because we are taking the 3 refuges, and because we're taking the precepts, and because we are committing ourselves to the practice of the Dharma, that we too will become awakened. And then the third time, we're taking refuge it's in the present, we're taking refuge in that Buddha nature that already exists in us, and which is guiding us and directing us in the present. And the idea, and even the idea that awakening and Buddhahood are something to be attained in the future is an illusion, because that's already imminent within us. So this is the way I understand the taking refuge in the Buddha. Now, we all are going to die, and that's absolute inescapable fact. That's the way life is. And part of going for refuge to the Buddha is that the Buddha was also known as the conqueror of death. Not in the sense that the Buddha was immortal and is still walking the earth somewhere, and just did an Elvis Presley on us. But that the particular place that death occupies in our psyches as that which we fear, as the annihilation of ourself, that is the sense in which death is conquered by the Buddha. Because the Buddha discovered a truth that went beyond those appearances. And once he had gone beyond those appearances, then the appearance of death, just like all of these other appearances, was understood and seen beyond. And so death was conquered. Now, your friend has the knowledge that somebody else might not. Someone my age might think, well, I have, probably a good 20 years, maybe 30 years, who knows. And somebody younger than me, it might seem like they've got a long, long time. If you're 40 years old, you might feel like, well, I've got the whole other half of my life to become awakened in. But for someone like yourself, you don't know how long you'll live, but pretty good chance it won't be 20 years. It'd be wonderful if it was, I think. I love having you around. That's my selfish point of view. But we're realistic. And your friend, because she has a diagnosis of cancer, knows it's much more, it's coming up much more quickly. So, because she failed to get what she needed to conquer death already, does that mean that it's too late because she only has, who knows, a few weeks or a few months left? And I don't think so. I certainly hope not. Because, well, and one of the things that we're taught is that a person can achieve awakening at the time of their death, too, so that even if they haven't already achieved it. But the other thing is that it can happen any time. And the essence of it is the letting go of the kind of attachments to the misperceptions and the misunderstandings that are causing the fear and confusion to be there. Your friend, that's what you said, your friend is experiencing a lot of fear and confusion. And I think that's what happens to most people when they really confront death. It is the great unknown. There is the fear of the complete annihilation of the self and the not knowing of what it means. And the confusion because a lot of the ideas that at one point they thought, at one point seemed to give them comfort and allowed them to think about the prospect of death without it creating too much disturbance for them. They don't work anymore, and so there's a lot of confusion. You said your friend, the Buddha doesn't mean anything anymore. God doesn't mean anything. But the interesting thing is that she probably knows and understands both Buddha and God much better than she does death. Death is more of a mystery than either of those other two. To the extent that we succeed in the path that the Buddha taught, to that extent we come to the place of accepting what is, suchness. And what's really interesting about it is that it's not just a place of stoic sort of resignation to, oh, well, that's the way it is, there's nothing I can do about it. But rather the embracing it, as I said last night, it is actually perfect. But that involves a lot of letting go, a lot of surrendering, a lot of completely changing the way that we've been looking at things up to now. And a person I don't think they have to practice many, many years and undergo any kind of dramatic transformation. I think that perhaps the situation of directly facing one's death can do as much as years of meditation to help the mind let go of its delusions. But first there has to be a recognition of what's taking place. I mean, you can't be, if you're so totally lost in the delusion, I think you're pretty helpless and it's very hard to find the way out. And that's what I sense is the difficulty that your friend is having. That there's a sort of, she fears that she is the mind that both creates and experiences the fear. Because that mind is what seems to be at risk of death when the body dies. That mind, I mean, she's probably already not that attached to her body. I mean, most of us overcome that pretty early on. And the only reason that we remain attached to our body is that it serves the needs of our mind. It supports us, right? But we identify who we are with the mind and the mental processes. And it's her mind, it's that very mind that fears its own destruction. That's that mind that looks at the way things appear to be, and as a result of that draws the conclusion that something terrible is about to happen, and therefore generates the emotion of fear, and then that very mind itself is the experiencer of the fear. So that's what I mean about the circularity of it. And so the only way to break that cycle is to somehow interrupt that cycle of attachment and belief that leads to the fear, or the reaction to the fear and the resistance to the fear when it's there. And the confusion and other things. I think that your friend is perfectly right. There is not the Pure Land kind of Buddha who is going to somehow reach down and miraculously prevent the inevitable from happening. And it's a little bit late to try to generate the faith that kind of Pure Land Buddha, that she is going to still be her own recognizable self who is reborn in some Pure Land and receives the teaching of some Buddha, or that God is going to, at the time she dies, that she's going to find herself in heaven, and there's going to be all of her friends and family that died before her with their arms open saying, "Oh, it's so good you finally come to join us." It's a little bit late to start.
Well, she's too sophisticated for that.
Yeah, too sophisticated, and it's too late for that.
I told her, I reminded her that the only thing that never ends is now, and that I thought of the idea that she's beginning a process, and it's a little bit like being pregnant.
Yeah.
When you're pregnant, you don't go back.
That's right.
And say I'm not pregnant anymore.
It's a process. That's right.
And I think part of the thing was that she just didn't even want to acknowledge that it was like a kind of a denial. And she's a very smart woman, and she's a little younger than I am, but not much. But I think that she was just being very honest, and I really appreciated that she would talk to me, and I told her to call me in the middle of the night or whenever she wanted to, because there are not too many people that you can talk about these things with if they're so attached to you and so fond of you, like your family and your friends and everything. They don't want to talk about it, or they don't want to even think about it, and they don't want to hurt you, and you don't want to hurt them. So
let's all pretend this isn't happening.
Yeah. So anyway, I thank you for those things.
Well, I think the important thing is to help her to come to that place of just being in the present.
Yeah, that's
because
what I kept saying over and over again.
Who knows how many months, days, minutes, hours that she has, but to lose them, or to spend them in fear and anxiety and confusion, would be really unfortunate. And that as long, this is the thing about, we all believe in death, but it's all secondhand. We've never experienced it, so all we ever experience is the present, and the nature of the present is that it is our experience, and so to make the most of the present would probably be the most helpful thing that she could do, or that she could do for herself or for her family or for anybody else, and that you could help her do. Because regardless of what may happen, the air is still just as sweet, right?
We all understand that the now, but we just forget it constantly.
Well, that's right. We forget it constantly.
So it just needs to keep being reminded. She totally understood that when I said that. About the only thing that doesn't end is now, but she had forgotten.
Right.
She had forgotten, but she knew that perfectly. So I guess the thing is just keep saying, how is it now?
Well, I really like your comparison with being pregnant, because it is a process, and it's not a process that started when she got this diagnosis. It's a process that started when she was born. And 60 years ago, she didn't let the fact that she was going to die get in the way of her living her life. And that's what would be wonderful, is if she could approach it the same way now. But now I think it's a wonderful opportunity for her to let her spiritual training come to some kind of fruition. If she can recognize that the whole problem is that she's not being in the present, she's attaching to things that are no more than appearances. The self is an appearance. Death is an appearance. Death is empty. It's just an idea in the mind.
I think the other thing is to have an idea, and I think that's one of the great things about meditation. When you get in meditation, when you get into the big mind, when you get into a place where you see this, awesome emptiness, then you don't. Then you know that's liberation, and you know that's where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have any kind of a understanding, I asked her if she'd had some mystical experiences in the past in her life. And she said yes, she had, and mostly they were when she had some, in the 60s when she was experimenting with drugs. And so I said, well, think about those and what you saw, how your mind opened, how you pictured there, and so that you can know that the next step is liberation and not nothingness, and not, well, I think, as you said, that the fear is that you're not going to exist anymore, that you don't want to let go of yourself. But the consciousness, I believe the consciousness, or something, I don't know if it's a consciousness or what you'd call it, some kind of an essence,
yes,
continues into the next now, and the next now, and the next now, and the never-ending now.
Well, what we think we are and what we're afraid of losing doesn't even exist at all. But its non-existence is not in the nature of a total like a hallucination. It's not of the nature of hallucination. It's the nature of delusion. The self that we think we are definitely does not exist, but that doesn't mean that that's not a total negation. It's difficult to understand what lies behind that, because what lies behind that is just too big. It's too huge. It's like a drop of water within the ocean. Not a drop of water outside the ocean and falling into the ocean, but it's like a drop of water in the ocean. Well, what constitutes a drop of water in the ocean? Only some imaginary line that we would create when we were examining the hypothetical ocean with our human mind and our human senses. And we can say, okay, here's our ocean. Now, let's take a drop of water in the middle of the ocean, and let's make it this big. Okay, so we picture it as being that big. And that's the kind of self that we are. That we're like that. Our self is like the drop of water, which doesn't really have any existence other than as an idea in our mind. But what does exist is the ocean and the water. And that's what we really are, if we can use those words and say that without slipping into the idea that there's still somehow a separateness to that. And we cling to the separateness as well. We do. Even the idea of merging with the ocean, when it means the loss of separateness, can produce a discomfort in the mind. But I'm still thinking of the problem. How do we help somebody who has a very limited amount of time? But on the positive side is, if she practiced Zen for a long time, she must have learned something. And so maybe all she needs to do, maybe this is just a temporary setback. Maybe
panicky.
The panic has caused her to forget what she's already learned and what she already understands, and she just needs to be helped to understand that more clearly. But it's an interesting question for all of us. So, yeah. Yes?
Somewhat related, but this year there was a movie that came out called The Unmistaken Child, The Unmistaken Child, which was showed the process by which the Tibetan Buddhist monks identify a reincarnated Rinpoche or Lama of some kind. And so it showed this whole process. It was the helper, the assistant of this monk, the monk who died, who was sent on the mission to find his reincarnation. And so there are many aspects to the way this happened. There were astrologers who predicted where the child would be found. And so then the monk had to go and examine. It had to be a certain, I don't remember exactly, but like a family with only 2 children, and it had to be the second child or something. And it had to be certain things. So he went here and there and everywhere. And then he discovered the child, and then they take the child back to give him certain kinds of tests to see if he would identify the right mala that belonged to the Rinpoche who was being reincarnated, or the Lama who was being reincarnated, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so it's this idea. And last summer, I learned that some of the Tibetans, I don't know about all of them, believe that there is this thing called the Alaya Vishnana, which is some kind of karmic. This is what I understand. It's the karma that hasn't yet either come to fruition, or that's what gets reincarnated. That's what I understood to happen, because the Theravadins don't talk much in those terms at all. They talk about rebirth, or they talk about birth in the cycle of dependent origination, when you get born into a state of being, but it's always very much in this world. At least that's the way I understand it. I could be terribly wrong there. But so I wonder, could you? Because it's really hard to get out of the Western mind when you were trained in it for a long, long time.
Right, like since you were born.
Yeah.
At least in this life, anyway.
This life, anyway. Yeah, this life. So, could you speak to what is it that gets reincarnated? How is it that the Tibetans have this whole really amazing ritualized discovery process? The Southeast Asians don't seem to too much. The Zens, I don't think Zen people, I don't know what they believe about reincarnation. But, rebirth. And you were asking about that, something about that similar last night. Right?
Yeah, I'm sort of knowledgeable in Tibetan Buddhism in an amateur exposed way. I had to, but Go ahead. I was just thinking of another way that it's described. I mean, they have that, but also, because I don't know the Theravada, I mean, not that I know the other, but is that it's also your attachment. When you're not a lama or you have a conscious death and rebirth, it's your attachment that keeps coming back. Your desire keeps, I mean, that's what I've heard in Tibetan Buddhism. It's not like a soul. There is.
Well, how best to approach this?
Could you start with Hinduism and the idea of the soul, and then what Buddhism, what happened with the Buddha?
Yeah, I think that's a very good place to start. Is that in the what we call Hinduism today, but would more properly be called the Brahmanical tradition or the Vedantic tradition. It was Brahmanical first, and later became Vedantic. So, but before the Buddha was born, the common belief was that all people were reincarnated. That death and rebirth were that you had a soul or Atman, and that when you died, that soul or Atman came back again and acquired a new body and a newly conceived child. And they also believed that the kind of family that you were born into and the kind of circumstances were dependent upon your karma, and by karma, at the time of the Buddha, by what most people understood karma to be, was how well you lived your life according to the rules and standards of your place in life. And there was a caste system, and for each level in the caste system, there were certain roles and responsibilities and things you did do and things you didn't do. And of course, according to whether you were male or female and everything else, there were a lot of rules or guidelines about how you were supposed to live your life. And depending, if you lived as perfectly as you could according to the status that you were, then this was the karma that would cause you to be reincarnated in the next life in good circumstances or bad circumstances to the degree that you failed. And the highest caste were the Brahmins, and they had the greatest responsibility because part of their role in the society was to perform. Each Brahmin had to keep 3 sacred fires going in his home, and had to perform all kinds of rituals, and was often commissioned to perform these rituals by members of the other castes who couldn't perform them. And so the Brahmin had the responsibility for performing all these rituals properly, which the karmic outcome of that was that the realms of the gods would continue as they would, and the gods would continue to regulate life on earth and the weather and the harvests and everything else as it was. So it was a fairly complete system, but right at the core of it was the belief in that everyone was reincarnated, and everybody was reincarnated according to how well they lived their life. And karma means action, literally. And of course, in the Brahmanical tradition, it was the actions. And there wasn't any ethical component to it as such, except that, of course, there's an ethical aspect of how you fulfill your responsibilities in your role in life. But it was really about, the actions from every day, from the time you woke up till the time you went to sleep. If your actions were of a proper kind, that was good karma, and led to reincarnation. And so this was a common belief of society at the time the Buddha was born. Now, in addition to that, there was a new kind of more radical part of the Brahmanical tradition that had developed, who had recognized that being constantly reborn meant constantly re-dying. Rebirth means re-death. And so there came to be, and the Hindu scriptures called Upanishads are really all about the development of this idea, that in fact there was a way to escape from this cyclic rebirth that was called samsara, the wheel of birth and death, and that the escape from the wheel of birth and death could be achieved if you could discover your true self, your Atman, that part of you which was going to be reborn in life after life. And that Atman was actually identical with Brahman, which was the creator and source of everything. Brahman was described as Sat Chit Ananda, and that means being, consciousness, bliss is basically what Sat Chit Ananda was. And so this is the essence of Brahma, who is the source of everything, was being, consciousness, bliss, and that the Atman of an individual person was actually identical to that, and if you could discover your true self and achieve union with Brahman, then when you died you would not be reborn, but rather if you achieved this union in lifetime, then when you died you would permanently achieve union with Brahman. So a huge amount of the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha was putting a whole new set of ideas into an old set of clothes. And he kept redefining these familiar ideas. He began if you look in the sutras, when he's talking to the Brahmins or when he's talking to different groups, he always starts out accepting their ideas and terminology, but then kind of turning them upside down in the course of the discourse that he goes. He did this with reincarnation. He changed it just this much to say not reincarnation but rebirth. Right? And he overtly denied reincarnation, but in all of those discussions where people would be thinking in terms of reincarnation, he would substitute the idea of rebirth. And the same thing, people will say karma, and he was very clear. He'd say, well, when I say karma, I mean intention. And this is an important, this wasn't just, sort of this wasn't just sort of saying the same thing a little bit differently. He was saying something totally different. Because the people he was speaking to, karma meant action, and it meant, did you bow down when you were supposed to, and did you slice this the way you were supposed to, and light that the way you were supposed to? It all meant the action. And he was saying, when I say karma, I mean intention. And he took it completely out of the realm of mechanical actions produce results in future rebirths to making it totally ethical and totally moral. He made karma into a moral issue. So that karma was not the action you performed, but the intention that lay behind the action. And then also, as you know, he over and over again taught that there was no Atman. The sort of run-of-the-mill householder who believed in the Brahmanical tradition believed he had an Atman and was content to try to do his best to make sure that Atman was reincarnated in the best possible way. all of the other various bands of ascetics who were wandering around in the forest and from village to village and with alms bowls and things like that were on a different path. They were trying to escape from the cycle of reincarnation and rebirth and to achieve the union with Brahma. And so he was taking these same ideas and where was I going to go with that part of it there? Sort of lost my track there a little bit. Okay, so we see that he changed the meaning of rebirth and he changed the meaning of karma. And well, anyway, let's go back to this. Of course, yes, he was teaching selflessness, no self. Okay, that was what I was getting to. All of these more spiritually sophisticated practitioners were concerned with discovering the true self that they really were, that was identical with Brahman. And here he was teaching that there is no such thing. You're not going to find what you're looking for because it doesn't exist. A good illustration of this, I read this sutra a few weeks ago on Thursday night. I don't know if you were there, but it's his two chief disciples for most of his life, Mahamoggallana and Sariputra. They were friends, and they had dedicated their lives to the spiritual pursuit of the discovery of their true Atman. And at one point they separated and went in different directions, but they pledged to each other that if either one, this is called the deathless, was the terminology that they used. They were seeking the deathless, which is another term that the Buddha took over. But by deathless, what they meant is once you'd achieved union with Brahma, you would not be reborn. And so that's what they meant by the deathless. So they pledged to each other that should either one of them ever discover the deathless, that they would immediately come and tell the other. And this was very, very soon after the Buddha's enlightenment, and the first people that he taught who achieved enlightenment were 5 fellow ascetics who had practiced with him before his enlightenment. One of them encountered Sariputra, and Sariputra was a very sincere, dedicated seeker, and asked of everyone he came across, wanted to know the teaching they followed. And I can't remember the name of this monk at the moment. It might come to me. But Sariputra saw him and realized that there was something very, very different. And he said to him that you seem to be so clear and calm and so certain in your understanding. Please tell me, who is your teacher and what is his teaching? And he said to him that I have not, my teacher is the Buddha, and I've not been a follower of him for very long. So I really can't explain his teaching, but I can tell you this much. So he spoke to him, though, about the basics of impermanence. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but I remember exactly what Sariputra's reaction was. He got it. He got it immediately, just like that. Whatever arises due to causes and conditions must pass away. And you see, what he'd been doing is he had for years been putting all of his effort into searching for his true self in all kinds of practices, meditative and otherwise. And here he'd received this brief teaching which basically validated what he'd already discovered but didn't know that he had discovered, which was that there is no self, that everything that arises due to causes and conditions passes away. So immediately he went and found Mahamoggallana. Mahamoggallana says, "Whoa, you look really different. Tell me, is it true? Have you seen the deathless?" And Sariputra says, "Well, yes, I have." And so he tells him the same thing, and he gets it right away too. So the two of them say, "Okay, we've got to go find this Buddha guy," and they went to follow it up. And the second sermon that the Buddha is supposed to have taught, also the same first 5 fellow ascetics of his. The first sermon was called the turning of the wheel, and the second sutra is called the teaching on selflessness. So and he taught them both to the same 5 groups of ascetics. As a matter of fact, the sutras are not that long, but apparently this went on for about a week. And one or two of them would go to town and gather food for the other 4, so they just kept talking pretty much around the clock. But we have these 2 teachings, the turning of the wheel and the sermon on selflessness. That this is what we know about the Buddha's first teaching to these 5, and the second sermon was on selflessness. So right away, since this was such a linchpin of the teaching of the Buddha, long before he ever adapted the idea of reincarnation by speaking of rebirth, that we have to reconcile the ideas. And of course his monks did too. So they said to the Buddha, they said, rebirth, what is it? Blessed One, that is reborn, if there is no self. And he said, it is your karmic predispositions. It is that accumulated karmic tendencies. Well, Buddha taught a very different kind of karma too, because later on in the Hindu tradition, you see, in the Brahmanical tradition, you would be reborn according to your actions in this life, which required that there would be some sort of supernormal power that kept track of such things and put you in the right place when the time came. Mm-hmm. And this was carried on later, and in the Brahmanical tradition, which became Vedantic and Hindu, this came to be very, very strongly developed, the whole idea of, you've heard of the Akashic record. So, the Akashic record is where all of your karmic acts are recorded, and there's some supremely supernatural process that pays out the results according to your past deeds. The Buddha, though, like everything else, he rearranged this. He spoke in terms of the 5 aggregates, and that the aggregate of mental formations is what is this. These are the tendencies that cause us to have the kind of perceptions that we have, react to them the way we do, that cause certain kinds of intentions to arise, which lead to our speech and our deeds, wholesome or unwholesome. And every experience we have and everything that we ever do becomes a part of these mental formations. Karmic formations, they are called. They're sankharas or formations, but they are kama sankharas. They're karmic formations. And so, of the 5 aggregates that you are, one part of the 5 aggregates is this complex, interwoven collection of experiences and inclinations that makes you be and behave and react the way that you do. And this is what you have to change, if you're going to become enlightened. So that, if you become angry or if you steal and lie, it's because that you have made yourself into the kind of person that does those actions. And so to cease doing that, you have to make yourself into the kind of person who doesn't do those actions. Your unwholesome mental states and thoughts, when they arise, need to be transcended and need to be replaced with wholesome mental states and thoughts. This is the intention that the Buddha meant by karma. And your karma makes you to be the kind of person you are. And so the experiences that you have, every experience you have is a result of your karma. And the way that you tend to react to it is a result of your karma. But it's not fixed. You can change that. So when asked, what is it that's reborn if there is no self? And the Buddha said, it is only this. It is these karmic formations. So what does this mean then? Well, it means that to the degree that we accumulate a lot of wholesome or unwholesome karmic formations, when this body and this mind disappear, that those karmic formations somehow continue to have an influence. Somebody else is going to inherit them, so to speak. And when you were born, you had certain characteristics. Biologists would explain them in terms of your genetics, and psychologists would explain them in terms of the environmental circumstances that you were exposed to and the way they interacted with your genetics. But I think everybody agrees that, well, there's some things about the way people are that, it's really hard to account for. So I suppose they would be accounted for as a kind of inheritance of karmic propensities from beings that had lived before. But when we're thinking this way, we're still thinking we're still thinking like these pre-Buddhist Brahmanical people to a large degree. And we're taking this group of karmic propensities and we're thinking of them as a new kind of substitute self, which gets continued on. So somebody else born with all my karmic propensities, we kind of smuggled the self back in there in that way. Well, that's not an altogether bad way of looking at things, but I like to make a comparison with the things that we do know and understand. We can understand that everything that we regard as being physical and material is completely interconnected, right? And in the last half of the last century, in the last half of the 20th century, incredible strides were made forward in science in understanding that very interconnectedness, to the extent that it's realized now that subatomic particles on the opposite sides of the universe remain linked and interconnected. And so, of course, we can see in the world around us how everything is interconnected. But scientists are saying that the interconnection is even more than that. When they say things like, when a butterfly flaps its wings in Hong Kong, it will cause a thunderstorm in London. And that's based on measurable scientific fact. And physicists are saying that subatomic particles in every part of the universe are still interactively connected. So in a sense, we can say about materiality, well, yeah, everything's interconnected, everything causes everything, nothing's really separate. And we look at our body, and the parts of our body are constantly being exchanged with everything else, and are influenced by everything else, and in turn influence everything around us. And so we don't have any trouble wrapping our minds around the idea that, well, yeah, this body is just like it's a temporary aggregate of this stuff that the whole universe is made of. And there's nothing really special about any part of it. It's just, it happens right now temporarily to be gathered together in this way. Is this an easy concept to grasp and rather agreeable to your own understanding of things for everyone here? If it is, let's just transfer it to the mental realm. Why should, in the realm of mind and consciousness, why should anything be any less interconnected? And if there is any truth to this non-duality nonsense that all these sages are always babbling about, then that pretty well fits, doesn't it? I mean, that forget the material, let's just focus on the mental. I mean, even when we're talking about a friend dying, it's their mind that where the attachment is. But this mental stuff that we're so attached to, you know, if it is all one and all interconnected totally, then your karmic propensities can't really be separated out, can they? I mean, they can be separated out in the same way that your body is temporarily. And even after you die, parts of your body can tend to stay together while other parts go elsewhere. Right? You die and a wolf comes along and eats your body. Quite a bit of your body ends up being wolf body and staying together there. But not everything. Some of it goes other places as well. But it all continues. So karmic propensities can be reborn. And it makes sense that in the realm of the mental, the karmic propensities also tend to hold together to some degree or another. Not that they are a self, but rather they are causally related to each other. The karmic propensities in their totality at the time you die accumulated over the course of a lifetime, causally connected to each other. And so there are connections between them. And so, you know, like a drop of ink and a glass of water, it tends to stay together for quite a while. It just gradually spreads out and diffuses. So as new beings come into existence, and they're really only a part of this wholeness. They're not a separate part of it. And so the idea that they can be affected in such a way that they inherit, sort of like we inherit genes from our parents, that we can inherit karmic propensities from beings that preceded us, isn't too absurd an idea. Maybe a little bit on the metaphorical side, but that's all right. We have to understand things on the metaphorical side. What it means is that every time a person makes a lot of good karma, they increase the total amount of good karma of the universe. And if some of that happens to hold together closely enough, it might actually create a path that leads to that karma achieving a kind of Buddhahood too. Okay? This idea of reincarnations in Tibet was invented a few centuries ago. It is uniquely Tibetan. The Tulku system in Tibet is very unique in the world, and not only in Buddhism but in the world. And it came at a time when in Tibet there were large monasteries which would be directed by some great lama. And lamas were celibate and had no children. And so there were problems of continuity and succession. And the solution was to use whatever supernatural powers that anybody could muster up to try to find a being who had the suitable karmic propensities to take the place of the one who had passed away. And so we don't need to mistake the idea that the Dalai Lama that lives today is the same person as the Dalai Lama that preceded him. And he doesn't think that. He looks at the series of Dalai Lamas and he says there's certain ones he has more in common with and some he can't relate to at all. But I think the task in the Tibetan system, and at the time in medieval Tibet, was a pretty good idea, was that the most highly developed lamas would go out and try to locate a young child who would be with the proper training would be the most suitable successor to the lama who had passed away. And so they developed all kinds of means of doing this. But that doesn't mean that you have to accept the notion of reincarnation, which is not a Buddhist idea. Now, what is very interesting is most average Tibetans probably totally believe in reincarnation to the same degree that Indians do. But most sophisticated virtuoso lamas, like the Dalai Lama, know better. And you find the same thing throughout the Buddhist world, that in Southeast Asia, people give to the temples and they support the monasteries and things like this, so that they will be, quote, reborn in good circumstances. What they really mean is reincarnation, and they don't really understand the idea of rebirth. And so throughout the Buddhist world, there is what is called village Buddhism or common Buddhism, which includes a lot of ideas that are very comforting and easily understood. And then there's the more sophisticated virtuoso Buddhism, which is those very same ideas in a more refined and purified understanding, which is really what you keep finding when you read the sutras over and over again. The Buddha said, when I say karma, I mean intention. And the Buddha said that I speak of rebirth, not of reincarnation, and all these different kinds of things. Yeah?
So the difference between those two would be reincarnation is the idea of a self being reborn, so to speak, in another body, continuing
Some kind.
in a new lifetime, versus rebirth is the idea of that karmic tendency.
That's right.
Finding its way to another
That
being.
those karmic tendencies. The idea of rebirth is that, as in the physical world, if you commit an action, it has all kinds of reverberations until the end of time. Is that obvious? That if you commit an action, a physical action, that it has all kinds of. I mean, you commit a large action, and that's obvious. You crash a jet plane into the World Trade Tower, and the reverberations affect everybody on the planet, and they will for centuries to come, for I don't know how long to come, but ultimately forever. And because the future history, long after mankind no longer exists, whatever condition the universe is in, the future will be affected by that. And likewise, the same thing, with you. If you tell somebody a lie next week, you may not know the effects of that, but it will continue to reverberate in one form or another. Nothing will ever be the same as it would have been if you hadn't done that. So everything reverberates. And so in this regard, within the stuff of ultimate reality, all of our intentional actions continue to reverberate, and that's what's reborn. What the Buddha said is that what you think of as a self, or what you would call a soul, something that is permanent and abiding, is unitary, and is continuous, that these are the qualities of an Atman that you don't have. And if you know what they are, you can look for them and find that they don't exist. They are an Atman is persistent rather than constantly changing and in flux. An Atman is separate and independent from other things. And an Atman is one. We only have one soul, or one self. Okay, it's unitary. So it's, to use simplified terms, it's permanent, uniform, and separate, distinct. And the other two properties that it accounts for is the Atman is the experiencer. The Atman is the seer, the hearer, the feeler, the thinker. And the second thing is the Atman is the doer, the intender. Okay? And so these, if you search for the Atman, if you search for the experiencer and the doer, you won't find them. If you search for that which is permanent, distinct and separate, and unitary, you won't find it. But if you examine the five aggregates will account for experiencing, and they will account for doing and intending, and they will account for any illusion of permanence and oneness and separateness. But you find that there is no Atman that has these particular qualities and characteristics. So that's what's not reincarnated. But all of the actions, everything you do, reverberates through the world. But likewise, on the psychic level, all of your intentions reverberate as well, endlessly. And as a psychophysical entity in this life, you are a distinct mass of intentions, and that is a karmic propensity that and it didn't come from nothing at the time you came into the world as a complete vacuity which you filled, but it was an outcome of what was already present, and when you pass, it will continue in the same way.
It's easier for me to get the part of not permanent, not unchanging, not singular, etc., etc. That's much easier for me to get than the part of there's no doer, there's no experiencer. Yeah. that part I just can't get.
Well, that's what the
really hard.
That's what the meditation practice is about. That's what insight allows you to do. Insight allows you to have the experience of, as in the Buddha's own words, in the seeing there's only the seeing. There is no seer. In the thinking there is no thinker. And if you practice meditation insight, you have those experiences. You see that that's not there. If you practice mindfulness, mindful awareness, you see the intentions and inclinations to thought and action arising out of your past conditioning, and that there is no self that is creating those, that they are karmically, karma in the sense that the Buddha used it, they are karmically produced results. what happens in the present moment is going to determine what happens in the future. And the present moment is that crucial point at which the direction can change. But you have to practice mindfulness to see that. The self is a creation of the mind. And an intention, an emotion will arise, and, it happens. An event will take place. As a result of that event, there will be a perception and emotion, and based on past experience, there will arise an intention to speak or act as determined by these past influences. The self is really a separate projection of the mind that, when it comes into being, appropriates that intention as being its own. That, I decided that I'm going to do this. I feel this way. It appropriates the whole experience. This happened to me. I saw that. I felt this way. I decided to do this. But that is nothing more than the story that our mind is telling. Our mind tells a story, and the center of narrative gravity is the self. But the self doesn't exist as any kind of substantial thing. And the important part about what you're saying is that the intention didn't come from some self. It came from cumulative, it came from a kind of algebra of past experience.
So when we're meditating and we're in a place of some degree of quietness,
yes,
and then sort of a bubble appears in consciousness, which has some thought or feeling or picture or whatever happens to sound, whatever happens to be, then that's a manifestation of what you're describing.
That's right.
As opposed to your mind or your brain or yourself or some other word like that, making this thing happen.
That's right. So you have this experience in meditation. You're sitting there, and a thought appears. And really, honestly and truly in the experience, there's just the observation that it appears. But if you speak to somebody afterwards, you say, well, I had this thought.
Right, and it becomes I had this thought.
I had this thought. But that's added in afterwards. And this is the insight, is seeing that. And likewise, in the actions. If you practice mindfulness, you'll see that as you approach the door, your hand goes out to take the doorknob, and you would tell yourself the story that, well, I decided to reach out and take the doorknob, but you didn't really. You just decided to take credit for yourself, which just came into being. And yourself just comes in and out of being. It's just another mental formation. It's just another mental construct, and it comes in and out of being, and it's always different. It's never the same.
So you say there's no observer.
That's right. What there is, there is no observer. What there is, so is we can distinguish. This is the thing. You practice meditation, and what you realize is that there is conscious awareness. And some things are bathed in the light of conscious awareness, and some things are not. Some things are strongly illuminated by conscious awareness, and some are only weakly illuminated, and some not at all. And you realize that the mind is doing the same thing with experience. It's appropriating the illumination by conscious awareness as being an observing self. But phenomena occur, and mind is a phenomenon, and mind selectively notices some things and doesn't notice others, and what it notices, it interprets and gives rise to a perception. And so this process unfolds in the light of conscious awareness. And that's what we want to see when we practice mindfulness and in meditation, is that, aha, this is what's happening. There isn't an I that's having these experiences. In the seeing, there's only the seeing. And you're sitting and meditating, and there's a sound. And that sound is illuminated by conscious awareness. Some part of your mind brings up the label bird, and attaches it to that sound. And now that label is illuminated by conscious awareness. And some other part of your mind that is not conscious, and that is just as much a mechanical, physical process as the water flowing downstream in a river, generates the feeling that, the feeling of delightfulness, that you like the sounds of birds singing. Right? And that too then is exposed to the light of conscious awareness. But we make this into the story of, I was sitting and meditating, and I heard this beautiful bird. It made me so happy. And so that's what you want to come to understand firsthand. When you understand it, then you can start to see it more and more in all those circumstances where ordinarily you wouldn't. You don't need to always have the tremendous clarity and stability that you do in meditation to see it. And then you can come more and more to that place of simply knowing that these five aggregates are empty of a self. And of course the same thing is true of the way that the world that we experience. It too is empty of any kind of self-nature of being the way it appears to us to be. Because what appears to us is only our mind's fabrication around it, our mind's interpretation of it. And so I can keep going all the
Well,
time.
where does intuition fit into this?
Intuition is the understanding that comes from a deeper level of our mind than the level where rational analysis and verbal constructions take place. So, a simple example is that at an intellectual level, you know that the earth is round and that the earth rotates on its axis, and that's why we have sunrise and sunset. At an intuitive level, unless you're an airline pilot or an astronaut or an astronomer who spent a lot of time thinking and studying and seeing things in a different way, the average person, although they intellectually know the earth is round and that the earth goes around the sun and the earth turns on its axis, intuitively they live in a flat world where the sun rises there and sets there. The sun moves across the sky. Intuitively is that understanding that comes from a deeper, non-verbal, non-analytical level. And we can speak of intuition. Some people are very fascinated and fond of intuition because they often find that the deeper layers of their mind can tune into much subtler things. And, so we say that, well, I don't know why, but it didn't seem right to me, and I trusted my intuition. Some deeper part of your mind, not the verbal analytical part, was able to identify things. If the intuition was true, was able to identify things that this higher analytical, more superficial level missed. Body language is something like this. Body language is something that tends to be invisible to the rational, analytical mind. We just simply filter it out and overlook it. But there's a deeper level of our mind that tunes into it all the time, and we sense when somebody is having a reaction, or if somebody feels a particular way, or we read body language, and from that we speak of that as intuition. But the other sense, the same thing that we're talking about though as intuition, also constitutes our intuitive worldview. And the problem with our intuitive worldview is that I am a thing in a world of things that are separate from me, and those things can either make me happy or make me unhappy. That is our intuitive worldview, and that's mistaken. When you come to a point of having an intuitive worldview that all of this is empty, it's a projection of my mind based on my karma, and that this self is empty, and this mind that's doing the projecting is empty of any self-nature of being the way it appears to me to be. When you have that intuitive view, then you have a totally different kind of experience.
Well, is the mind the same as the conscious awareness then?
Conscious awareness is, they're not the same thing, because there's a whole lot to your mind that's never conscious. Most of your mind.
But it's, the way you describe it, it seems like the mind is a self-existent thing. It has all of these characteristics, it has all of these underground currents and and all these things that it is. So is that it sounds the way when you talk about it that it is a self-existent thing.
Well, it's the same thing when we talk about the world. We talk about it as if it's a self-existent thing. So, if I wanted to give you instructions on how to make a pie, or how to find a particular house in Tucson, or anything like that, I'm going to speak as though these are all self-existent things. And they are self-existent to the extent that my private universe and your private universe are sufficient in such ways that you'll be able to find your way to that house in Tucson, and you'll be able to make a pie. Now, your experience of that pie after you've made it might be totally different than mine, But our minds are... So I can talk to you about the way your mind works in these terms, as though it's self-existent. But the fact is, your mind, too, that's only a way that it appears in consciousness. Consciousness is not the same thing as the mind. And we should have 2 weeks to talk about this.
That's true.
People come and go and look after our needs while we do so.
And pay our bills.
If you talk really, really
There's
fast.
there are two things to which, two very different, but at the same time the same things to which the term consciousness applies. The consciousness that we ordinarily experience is always consciousness of. And we can't even imagine consciousness without this duality of subject and object, because this is what our mind does. But the duality is an illusion that is imposed on a non-dual reality. And the illusion consists of consciousness and object of consciousness. The object of consciousness is an appearance. In the underlying reality, there is only the consciousness. Pure consciousness. The consciousness that illuminates your mental projections is identical to the consciousness that illuminates my mental projections. There is not Allegra's consciousness and Culadasa's consciousness. That is the illusion. There's just only this pure consciousness. But the mind is one appearance amongst many. And so that's the other thing, when we're meditating, you can come to very still places where you just see the mind separate from the things that are arising and passing away in the mind. The mind becomes very still, very, just totally calm, totally placid. Then you see one sensation after another arises and passes away, one thought after another arises and passes away. And if you observe this long enough, you start to become aware that these things are arising and passing away in the mind. And so you shift your attention, sort of a foreground-background shift. You ignore the appearances, or maybe you make your mind so calm that they almost disappear, that there's hardly ever a thought or a sensation. And then you find yourself looking at the mind, and what you discover then is that the mind too is just another appearance. And so all of these things that we say about the mind, which are really convenient and useful to talk about, but they too are just conceptualizations made out of nothing about something that is empty in itself. But we have to get there by stages. We have to start where we are. We started out thinking we're one thing in a world of things, and at the mercy of all these other things, because they're either going to hurt us or make us feel good. And so we move gradually, step by step, clearer understanding. So then one important stage along the way is seeing that the appearances that we experience as real are actually empty, but the nature of the appearances is causally determined by our past karma. So we see that those appearances are of the nature of causality, right? And we've made a huge step forward when that happens. And then we can turn that back on the self, and see the self that I feel like I am. It too is an appearance, and it too is causally determined. If we're still attached to the self and we have the thought that everything that arises from causes and conditions must pass away, we will be filled with terror. We will be miserable. We'll look around at this and we'll feel trapped. And we'll be disgusted with the world and disgusted with our life, and it will be a very uncomfortable experience. But then, at some point, if we continue to confront this, we'll stop resisting it and we'll let go of our attachment, and that will allow us to awaken. And that's what your friend needs to do, who is dying, because she's being confronted by the truth that everything that arises due to causes and conditions passes away. Nothing less. And yes, it's a cause of fear and terror and misery and confusion. Isn't there any way out of this? And you know that there's not. And what I'm describing to you in the progress of insight is the knowledge of fear, knowledge of misery, knowledge of disgust, knowledge of recollection, knowledge of determination, and then comes the knowledge of equanimity towards formations. And so it is an insight process, and that's also the process that your friend needs to go through. But we don't need to experience all of these things. If we can come to a place of sufficient equanimity through our meditation, through meditative equipoise, where we have a mind that's joyful, tranquil, and equanimous because of the training, then instead of we don't need to react with fear, misery, and disgust because because of our equanimity and tranquility, we don't have the attachment, and so we're much more easily we can greet this reality with an open heart and be willing to jump off the cliff and see if we can fly or not.
It'll be fun.
It is, yeah. Yeah. Once you learn to fly, then life is a great adventure, and death is a great adventure, and there's no problems. So I talked about a lot of things. Did I answer your question?
Very well.
What
Thank
was
you.
that string that you said, knowledge of this, knowledge of this, knowledge of this, knowledge of this? Could you just say that sentence one more time?
So which was that?
There was a sentence a few sentences ago where you said knowledge of, knowledge of, knowledge of, and then you ended up with equanimity. Could you say that sentence again with all the knowledges?
Oh, the knowledges, yes.
Yeah.
There's the
Just
knowledge.
repeat exactly what you said. I
Knowledge.
can't
There's
remember.
the knowledge of fear,
Uh-huh.
the knowledge of misery. When you start to realize that there's that to cling to anything is only to cause yourself suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Knowledge of disgust.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is a knowledge of recollection, and then that calms you down enough for the knowledge of determination. And so the knowledge of determination is where you realize that the only way out, this is where you really have to take refuge in the Buddha. It's like, oh no, there's got to be something more than this. This is terrible. So then you take refuge in the Buddha and say, okay, I'll keep practicing and get this. So, and then from that comes the knowledge of equanimity towards formation. Okay, these are called stages in the progress of insight. There's several different versions of them, but there's a very old text called the Visuddhimagga, which lays them out in detail. Very hard reading. And then Mahasi Sayadaw has a little booklet. It's also available on the internet if you look it up, where he describes the stages of the progress of insight. But these stages only need to be experienced in dry insight, where where you don't have the joy and the tranquility and the equanimity. If you have those, you don't bother with these. Misery, fear, misery, disgust, recollection, determination.
And what's recollection referred to?
Well, it means you look back over what you've just been going through.
Oh, okay.
Right? It actually happens at a point of emotional exhaustion. The yogi reaches a point of emotional exhaustion, from struggling in their mind, resisting in their mind against what they've seen. And then with this emotional exhaustion, then comes the recollection and the review and the conclusion that, well, it can't get any worse than this. I might as well go back to practicing.